Hi, listeners. Elizabeth here. Martha and I wanted to let you know that this is going to be the last episode of the first season of All Books Allowed. Thank you so much for listening to this first season. We're taking a break for the summer, but we'll be back in the fall with a new lineup of episodes on all things reading and books. So enjoy this conversation. It's a fun one, and we'll catch you again in a few months. Welcome to All Books Allowed with Elizabeth
and Martha, two sisters who love reading in all of its forms.
I'm Elizabeth, an academic librarian by day and fiction writer by night with a lifelong obsession with all things reading and books.
And I'm Martha, a busy real estate agent who came to my love of reading later, but now I'm an audiobook power user. Every 2 weeks, we get on Zoom and chat about the books we're reading and delve a little deeper into a topic related to reading or publishing.
If you love reading, nerding out about books, and sassy millennial hot takes, this podcast is the place for you. Hi, Martha.
Hey, Liz.
How are you?
I am really great. I am so excited today because we have a guest, Sarah T. Dubb. Sarah is a writer, public librarian, parent, and activist living the dream with chickens and desert tortoises in her hometown of Tucson, Arizona. Birding with Benefits is her debut novel. And I just read that from the back of her novel that I have in my hand. We're so excited to talk to you, Sarah. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really glad to be here. This is going to be fun.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we are. We're really excited to talk to you. But before we start talking to you about reading and writing and your awesome novel that we both loved, we usually start our episodes by talking about what we're currently reading. So if you are game for that.
Sure. Should I go first?
Oh, if you want. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah.
Let's do it. Okay, so I'm currently revising a lot for my next book. And when I'm writing it, I have to read like really particular things and I reread a lot. So I have been rereading some of my favorite historical romances. Specifically, last night I was rereading The Countess Conspiracy by Courtney Milan, which is just one of my absolute faves. It's like nerdy science. The woman Violet is a countess and she's a scientist, but no one will take her seriously because she's a woman. So for 5 years, her best friend Sebastian, who is a rakish, gorgeous man, has been posing as the scientist, giving these lectures of her research. And he's been in love with her the entire time. She has no idea. She doesn't think she's lovable. So it's just one of those stories where he's just utterly devoted to her. And then he finally tells her, and I just love nothing more than a scene where one person is like, wait, what? And the other person is like, yeah, I'm utterly devoted to you. Like I've loved you our entire lives, you know? I just love it.
It's so giving good. Mr. Darcy vibes.
Yeah. She's just going about her business and she does not know what's going on. And finally he's like, Violet, I love you. And she's like, oh, you mean like a friend, right? He's like, no, That's not what I mean. It's so good.
That sounds great.
Sounds really cute. Yeah. I've never read any Courtney Milan, but I have certainly heard of her. And now I want to read that. I'm going to put it on my TBR immediately.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, please do. Her books are fantastic.
Okay, awesome. Martha, what are you reading right now?
I am reading a book called Whale Fall. It's kind of a new release by Daniel Kraus. This one is for my book club, and we explore different genres every month. So this is our pick for adventure fiction, although Goodreads describes it as horror fiction, thriller, sci-fi, kind of all the things. It's a diverse mix. And I just started it, and it's really short chapters, so I think it's going to go pretty quickly. A guy gets trapped in a whale, kind of like Jonah in the whale, but it's accurate because he did the research about a whale's real anatomy and based the book on that. I'm really curious to see where it goes.
Oh my God, that is so wild.
I am very excited about this. I'm writing this down like this minute.
Yeah.
This is amazing.
And it started out talking about his relationship with his father, which is not the best, not the greatest. So it's interesting how they're starting it off, like his motivation for how he ends up in the situation he ends up in. It's really good so far. This is what I love about my book club is that we read books that I never would have picked up otherwise. And it really pushes you out of your comfort zone. So that's the book I'm reading. And then I'm listening to The Wisteria Society of Lady Scoundrels, which is the first book in the Dangerous Damsels series by India Holton that Liz recommended a few months back. It's great. It's been really great so far. And the narrator is awesome. So I've been enjoying that.
Yeah, I really loved that book.
So what are you reading, Liz?
I am still reading Wayward by Emilia Hart, which I was reading last time. And then I just started a new audiobook, Death Comes to Marlowe by Robert Thorogood, which it's the second book in the, I think that the first book is called Marlowe Murder Club. So that might also be the name of the series. But if anyone listened to early episodes of our podcast, you would have heard me raving about that book, and I just loved it. I really love cozy mysteries, specifically to listen to for some reason. I don't know. And I just started that. The opening is great, as I would have expected. So yeah, that is what I'm reading.
Nice. Well, Sarah, we want to start off our discussion by getting a sense of you as a reader. Have you always been a reader?
Yeah, for sure. Always been a reader. Was definitely the kid like reading voraciously, even in elementary school. Got really into literature in high school. And then I was an English major, also got my master's in English. So it did a lot, always reading. Was always reading literary fiction, really, until after I had kids. Yeah, either the classics or lit fic with, I don't even know if I could say the occasional science fiction or something. I was a pretty serious literary fiction reader for a long time. Those times have changed, but that's definitely how I started out as a reader.
Mm-hmm. Sounds similar to Liz's.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's like exactly my trajectory.
Mm-hmm.
And after I had kids, my brain, I didn't have that space, and I had this infant now, and I couldn't handle so many of the heavy topics. And I was really looking for other stuff to read, and went through a pretty long stage of reading, not just cozy mysteries, but culinary mysteries. I read a lot of Diane Mott Davidson. I don't know if you've read any of her books, but her main character is a caterer in a ski town in Colorado. And there's recipes throughout the book. She's cooking recipes and solving mysteries and murders. And I loved those. So I think that was the first time that I went into genre fiction, understanding what it had to offer me and how it helped me use different parts of my brain and carry on with the rest of my life. But I was a more serious literary fiction person before then.
How did you start reading literary fiction? Because I mean, your trajectory sounds almost exactly the same as mine, but when I was a teenager, the way that I got into that idea that I read serious books, I don't know if that's what your attitude was, but that was definitely my attitude, was because I started reading the classics when I was in high school. And so I read Jane Austen, and I read Charlotte Bronte, and I read Les Miserables, and I didn't have time for any other books except for classics. And so then what that morphed into when I started reading more modern books is I was like, oh, well, I need to read things that are going to be classics someday, right?
Great question. And it's hard to think about how those pathways went, because I definitely did start in classics, the things assigned for school, and then branching off of them. I was obsessed with The Tale of Two Cities. I just remember being so obsessed with that book. It's so dramatic. I just loved it when I was 16.
Oh my God. I sobbed at the end of The Tale of Two Cities, cried. And now looking back, I'm like, what on earth? Why was I...
And there's those books that are so special to you then that you almost, there's part of me that wants to reread them, and there's part of me that wants to never open them again, right? Because they were so special to me at that time. I got really obsessed with F. Scott Fitzgerald also. I read all of his books. This Side of Paradise was my favorite. I was just obsessed with that book. And I have no idea why. And it's just about some guy at Princeton. And I was like, I have to go to Princeton, right? I grew up in Tucson, Arizona. And I'm just like, I have to go live this life of these F. Scott Fitzgerald characters. And I think probably in college, because I was an English major, and then I was able to take pretty specific classes that introduced me to more writers, taking me more to the lithic way. I remember taking a class specifically on shame. And so we read books that the professor put together on that theme. Jeanette Winterson was an author I really loved when I was in college. So I think there were some writers that I was introduced to through classes, and then I just once I find a writer I like, I'll just read all of their books. It's like, okay, let me read every David Mitchell book that's ever existed. Let me read every Barbara Kingsolver book, going down those rabbit holes. And I definitely have a family of readers. So Christmas is like exchange of books, right? I have an older brother who's a really intense reader. And so he would always recommend books to me, or my dad would hear about books, or my husband and I exchange books. So definitely just the culture of my life is very bookish too. So I think that's helped me find different books and different writers over time.
Yeah, that's cool. Mm-hmm. I totally know what you mean about not wanting to revisit things that you read and loved. I don't know if this is what you meant, but I'm sometimes worried that they're not going to hold up, that I will be like, why did I like this book? But it's also interesting that you were saying at the beginning that you're rereading something in sort of a comfort way while you're writing. Because we recently did an episode on rereading, and I generally am not a rereader. So that's interesting to hear you talk about your thoughts on rereading with different types of books.
Yeah. And I think maybe with romance, I'm going into the ones that are real sources of comfort or inspiration. Literary fiction, I've only reread a couple things. And that's been stuff that I read as a teenager and have thought, oh, what if I get more out of this as an adult, right? Like Catcher in the Rye, I hated in high school. And I reread it as an adult. And I was like, oh, it's a good book. But yeah, I definitely have go-to romances that I read, or I'll go back. I read almost everything from the library, and I do a lot of e-reading. So I check a lot of books out on Libby. And I have recently learned this amazing thing. So I never bothered bookmarking or highlighting because it was a library ebook. But in fact, if I have checked a book out before in Libby and then I check it out again, my bookmarks are there for me.
Ooh.
I was rereading Countess Conspiracy and it had bookmarks in it. And that's also this fun visitation because I'm like, what did I bookmark and why? And am I going to bookmark something different this time because a different part is speaking to me? So I do reread a lot of romance, especially when I'm drafting, because I just need to relax at night and feel good and feel happy. But it's just like this landmines everywhere when you're also trying to draft.
Yeah.
So
that makes sense.
You like to know what to expect.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Just lean into what you know makes you feel good. And yeah.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of you drafting, let's talk a little bit about your writing. Similar to reading, have you always been a writer, or how did you begin your journey of being a writer?
Yeah, I've always written. It's always been a thing that has come easier to me. I think there are those of us who, whether it's a school essay or whatever, and I understand that for a lot of people, writing feels, I think my kids are this way with assignments. Writing feels really, really insurmountable to them, really, really challenging. Writing has always just been a skill that I've had. I wrote a lot of papers. I've always written professionally, not fiction, but written for publications and nonprofits, done freelance nonfiction writing. But I hadn't ever written fiction before 2020. When I was in college, I took a few nonfiction writing courses, all focused on creative nonfiction and eco-narratives and nature writing. And I definitely think threads of those for sure have carried all the way through into my fiction writing. But people would say, oh, Sarah, you're a good writer. You should write a book. And I was like, but what would the book be? I don't know. And I think part of that is truly from coming from such a deep literary fiction background that I was just like, not only do these plots seem very complex, they all are fairly painful. And that's just really not my personality. I don't have a brooding artist in me, right? And so there was never like, this is the story I have to tell. I just never felt that. And so I've only been writing fiction now for a few years. That started in 2020, but it's been really fun to see the connections with the types of writing I have done in the past and how I pull some of that into my fiction writing.
So how did you start writing in 2020? What spurred you to get into it?
I was listening to the podcast y'all did about romance, and I have a very similar story, which is that I read my first romance in a reader's advisory class in library school. And I grew up with my mom reading romance all the time. She had a lot of the trade paperbacks, and they were definitely my first sex education for sure. I learned exactly where in the book to open it to, like 2/3 of the way through, you're going to get right to the good stuff. So for me, the journey to starting to write fiction starts with really falling in love with romance. A Courtney Milan book called The Suffragette Scandal was the very first one I read. And I just absolutely loved it so much. And the timing, I'm sure, was significant. It was the spring of 2020. That semester started in person, and then everything shut down. All my kids came home. We're all four of us at home doing the pandemic together. And I just really sought comfort in romance and started reading so much romance. And I was reading it just nonstop for a couple of months, washing the dishes with a book propped up next to the sink. I had to do this a lot too when my kids were little. If it's my e-reader, I'm turning the pages with the tip of my nose if my hands are busy. I was at that level of obsessively reading romance novels. And I think I just one day was like, maybe this is something I would want to write. And I like to be really clear that it wasn't in a like, oh, anybody could do this. It's just a romance novel. But more that when you're reading genre fiction, whether it's a romance or a mystery or something, it has this framework, right? It's built within these walls, these kind of basic rules and expectations. And then within that framework, you have this map or these little road signs. And that felt really exciting to me. I was like, I can imagine myself going into this world, going into this framework and following some of these paths, but then doing my own work within that. It felt like suddenly here's a structure for you. You have a meet cute and you have an inciting incident and you have this and you have this and you know where it's going. And that was both comforting and exciting at the same time, right? So that was when I first thought, maybe I'll try this. And I think the timing was really right in terms of me needing a special place for my brain to go, right? It was the late spring of 2020. I think a reason I was able to stick with it is because I found that having that world to go into in my head was really important for my mental health. Because I'm for sure an anxiety. I will stay up all night, right? I'll start with we're out of milk to there will never be milk again in the universe, right? I can get there in 5 minutes. And so to lay down and be able to, instead of doing that, think about these characters or try to build the story in my head every night as I was going to bed was really, really important to me. So yeah, that's when I started.
Yeah. That makes so much sense. Like you were saying, you just didn't feel called to write literary fiction. And then when you found romance, it was more aligned with who you are as a person. And I think that's so cool.
Yeah, I think so. It had a lot more space for me to think, oh yeah, I could write something really happy and joyful. That would feel good. I would enjoy doing that.
I love that.
Exactly.
I feel like it really comes through with this book too. So you mentioned that when you discovered romance, you kind of dove right into it and read a ton of romance. Were there any particular authors or books that you can point to that influenced your writing style?
I started with historical romance. I read an absolute ton of historical romance. I read Courtney Milan, Sarah MacLean, Tessa Dare, Lisa Kleypas, Beverly Jenkins for sure. And so I started writing contemporary romance before I had read a lot of contemporary romance. And that was probably good, especially for working on my very first book. Writers will talk about how there's never going to be anything quite as pure as your first manuscript because you're writing it before you know anything. You don't know too much about publishing. You don't know too much about marketing. I just wrote the book of my heart, and it's not Burning with Benefits. It was a different manuscript. Not that Burning with Benefits is not the book of my heart, but my very first romance was just like me pouring out everything I had, everything I loved in the world and everything I loved about romance all into one book. It was all of my favorite things. And I think really if I had been reading a lot of contemporary romance at that time, I would have gotten much more in my head about it, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's very easy to be like, oh, well, such and such did that. Oh, well, look, this book's about a baseball player. Oh, well, look, this book's set in here. Oh, well, look. And in truth, all of our books have things in common and they're all different. And romance readers are so voracious that there is space for all of these books. I would say my biggest, especially with Burning with Benefits, my biggest contemporary romance influence has probably been Kate Claiborne. When I was revising that book, I read Georgie All Along. I don't know if y'all have read that, but there's something about Kate's writing where she really clearly gives you the themes. She repeats the words, right? And you're like, oh, I'm seeing that word again. I know where I am. Oh, I'm getting that feeling again. And I just really loved that. That has definitely influenced my writing since then. I try to think, what are my 3 words for this book? What are the themes? What are these words that I want people to walk away thinking about when they finish? She's been a big influence for me with that.
Mm-hmm. That's cool. I am interested, now that you have started writing and you are publishing your debut and mentioned that you're working on another, do you have a specific process for your writing? Do you have a routine or a schedule that you follow?
Not really. I'm not like a 5 a.m. writers club. I'm not a very routine person anyway. I'm a public librarian, but I work part-time. So I do have 2 days a week where I am at home when no one else is at home. And so those are my writing days. And then when I'm in a crunch time, I will take whole weekends. And I think my writing time really depends on what zone I'm in. So if I am just straight up drafting, kind of early drafting, in general, really, I work best in complete chaos, right? So when I first started writing that spring of 2020, like I said, I was home. I was in graduate school. I had a part-time graduate assistantship virtually. I had my 3 kids home doing school and a friend's kid home. I wrote so much, so fast because it was just bananas. And I think my brain really needs that to focus. So in fact, that is sometimes a difficulty of having a whole day at home. It feels like I should get a lot done, but in fact, that amount of space is challenging for me. And so adaptations I've done for that, one of my critique partners and I will get on video sprints where we'll be on Zoom with each other, but we'll set a timer for 25 minutes. We turn our cameras off. We do our stuff. We come back for 5 minutes. We check in on what we've done. That kind of stuff really helps me a lot. If I just have too much time, then yeah. So in general, I've been finding times to write. That's it. And then just in terms of my process in general, I rewrite a lot. My revision is largely rewriting and I do it over and over again.
So, nice.
Yeah.
What's your favorite part about writing or what you find the most rewarding about the whole process?
I really do love to revise. I write and I'll go forward and then I'll pause and I'll go back to the beginning again. And as I'm developing things, so I'll go forward and I'll think, oh, you know what? I really think he needs to have more of a wound from XYZ thing in his past. And I'll go back and I'll weave that through. My critique partners and I talk a lot about weaving. It's like, okay, I need to put this thread back in, or okay, I need to pull this thread out. It's not working and I need to get it out through the whole book. And so I go forward and then I go back again, then I go a little more and then I go back. And I think that's really fun. And it's cool having done Burning with Benefits and seen it from start to the end, that I understand that the very, very, very last pass was when the most magic was added into the book. Somehow the most special little things, because it was like ready for those. And so as I write now, I had to turn in my next book to my editor. And I was telling myself, this is the worst this book is ever going to be, right? This book is only going to get better. And the things about it that are going to shine and the things about it that are going to be the most special, I don't even know what those are yet. And I find that really exciting. I find that to be a really exciting thing about writing.
I really love that. And I also love your attitude, the way that you're able to reframe something that I think for me and for a lot of writers would be almost debilitatingly angst-inducing. I just love the way that you're like, yeah, but that means it's only going to get better. Whereas my pessimistic brain is like, this is terrible, you know? So I love that. That's...
Right. I mean, you just do kind of have to think like, oh, well, I mean, if I think it's terrible, then it's going to get better, right?
Better.
Like,
yeah.
I hope so.
Yeah. Right.
You've got to believe that, right?
So not to force you to be pessimistic, but I am also wondering what the most challenging part of it is for you. Do you get writer's block? Is there ever a time where you feel like, I hate this?
Yeah, yes, yesterday for sure. Even as I'm talking optimistically, I feel like a fraud because yesterday I was just so depressed all day. I think beginnings are really hard. I think that when I get discouraged is when something takes a really, really, really long time. I'm revising my next book right now. I'm changing the opening. And I'm really lucky to have a friend who has a little office space I can use sometimes. That's where I am right now, actually. And I came here yesterday and I was here for 7 hours and I wrote 1 chapter. And that was very discouraging because especially when you have a lot of things in your life and you have limited amount of time, it's really easy to think, I'm going to do this and I'm going to get XYZ done. I'm really going to make progress. And it's like, 1 chapter for real? I don't even know. I wish I had a camera on myself, right? To be like, how?
What was I doing?
What else are you doing? How many times did I this room is so small. I just walked around in circles in this room. I had 1,000 cups of tea, right? But at the same time, then I try to stop and say, well, I'm setting the story up, right? These chapters are really, really important. And in my revision process, I'm having to rethink who these characters are. And so it's really important that I set this groundwork. In Birding with Benefits, I rewrote the beginning 1,000 times because that part has to be right.
Yeah, I was going to say.
and everything else is going to come from it.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is really hard for me when I just don't get done what I had hoped or... it's just so much slower than you want it to
I'm
be.
not a writer, but I have other creative endeavors, and I find it so hard to be creative on demand. So when you were explaining your schedule and how you have a couple days off from your other job where you'll spend time writing, I was just thinking, oh, that would be anxiety inducing for me because, well, what if I'm not in a creative mood and I can't get anything done? Kind of what you're describing. And I just imagine that those days would be really tough, but you just have to imagine that the next day that you get a creative burst, you'll get a lot done,
Yeah. And especially with creative work, you're so easily derailed. It's okay, I've got this amount of time. This is going to be great. And then I get a call and it's oh, just want to let you know your kid, we had a chicken that was taken by a predator in our yard. He's feeling really sad because the chicken is dead, but I think he'll be okay. And I'm like, well, okay, thanks. My morning is shot now, right? How do I get back into this weird energy space when I know my kid is at school crying about his chicken? It's the smallest things that can derail you. And a thing I'm learning now too is with the schedules of publishing, it's so strange because they have this book that is just about to come out. But I've been working the last 6 months on a different book and I'm trying to finish that book, but Birding with Benefits is about to come out. And so my inbox is it's very exciting. It's a very, very exciting time, but I've realized, okay, I'm going to have to do a lot more of this revision on the weekends because luckily publishing does stop for the weekend. And so my inbox is quiet and I'm not pulled in that direction. So that's just another set of things to balance.
That is all really relatable. I appreciate you sharing it with us because I know that there are lots of writers and, like Martha said, other creative folks who it's the dream is that you would be able to do this full time. But then once people turn it into their full time job, quote unquote, they find out, oh, actually, now I have to do this. And that sort of takes some of the magic out of it, the creative on demand, like you said, Martha.
Yeah.
So yeah, there is something to that. You're fitting it in around the edges and in the cracks that, for a lot of people anyway, spurs the creativity in a way that it's difficult to be in that space all the time.
And I think that it's sometimes good to just expect that a little bit. I was complaining to one of my critique partners the other day. I was talking about all these interruptions. I was like, how do I do this? How am I going to do this? She's written more books than I am. And I'm like, I don't know and understand. How does this work? And she said, the book gets done in ugliness. That's just how it works. Your life looks and feels a little ugly while you're doing all of this. And that's just how it is. And I was like, hold on, and I wrote it down.
That is very
The book gets done in ugliness. Okay, yeah, sometimes it feels like that. Not always, but sometimes for sure.
Yeah, that is very wise. That's a good quote. Well, let's talk about Birding with Benefits specifically, even though, like you just said, your head is in another book, but it is coming out soon. It's coming out June 4th. So actually, I think that as people listen to this episode, it will have been out for a couple of days. We both absolutely loved it. I finished it and I was like, oh my God, Martha, you are going to love this. We don't want to give anything away. So no spoilers. Your author note mentions that you spent a lot of the pandemic bird watching, and it sounds like also a lot of the pandemic reading romance. So I'm assuming that that's partially how this book came about, but is there anything else that inspired you to write it?
Yeah, I had been a birder before the pandemic too. I started really paying attention to birds about 13 years ago, probably. And it's funny because some of the kind of most distinctive parts of the book namely the birding, and our characters are in their 40s. They were all born of the same seed, right? The first time I was like, I think I want to write a romance, and it's going to be about bird watching, and it's going to have a divorced woman in her 40s in it. Those things were just there. They were there, right? Whatever was happening in my head, they all came out together, these little ideas. In one way, it's because for me, the whole point of writing was to write about things that I really like. I really like birds and I really like the desert. It's set here in Tucson where I grew up and where I live. And I just knew that if I was going to write a book, it was going to be set in Southern Arizona.
The descriptions are so beautiful. It's just so beautifully described.
Yeah. So I think I just knew these are the things I like. Of course, this is what I would write about. But when I think more deeply about it, my experience becoming a birder is very similar to the experience of our female main character in the book, Celeste, which is that I cared about the natural world. I was a person who liked being outside, but I'd never really paid attention to birds. And then when I did, everything around me just looked a little different. It was just this different lens with which to look at everything around you. And I just really loved that as a thing to play with in a book and as a way to play on these larger themes of midlife and new love and the fact that in our 40s we still have a lot of time, right? They call it midlife for a reason.
Not
because you're only halfway through.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I love that. It is so specific, but it also fits so well into the genre. The way that you were describing, the way that the structure of genre fiction and of romance specifically is comforting because it gives you that shape, but then also allows you to play with it. I feel like the birding example is such a great example of how romance can do that, because I don't think that I've ever read another romance where birding figured heavily. But at the same time, it just seems like such an obviously great way for two people to fall in love. Like the way that you have the characters physically interacting during the birding, the way that John helps Celeste still her mind and pay attention, and the energy between them is so great. And I was just like, oh my God, this is the greatest setting for people to fall in love. Why didn't anyone think about this before?
Well, and something that I don't even think I realized was happening or I was doing until I was rereading the book. I recently annotated a whole copy of it for someone, the giveaway reader, and that was a really fun experience, just like writing notes through my whole book and reading it that way. And I think another thing that birding does in the book is it shows them being good partners, right? It gives them the opportunity to work together on something that is not a relationship. But we see how even with their differing personalities that like she brings this energy into the scenario and he brings some stillness and concentration, and they really enjoy each other and they really work well together. Anytime we can give our characters a thing to work on together like that, because as a reader myself, I always want to know, is this a good match beyond attraction, right? Is this a good match even beyond your emotional connection as people? Because we know most of a real relationship is like, who's going to wash the dishes, right? We want to see that they can work together. So I think that's another way that the birding serves the story.
Yeah.
It's also a good thing to do in real life when you're dating someone, is to have an activity. So you're not just sitting across from them, interviewing them essentially. So I love that about it
totally.
too.
Yeah, that is great. I also feel like what you just described is something that we realize. Maybe some people realize it when they're younger, but I was going to say that we realize as we get older and have had a few relationships where, oh, it turns out that maybe was just completely based on the fact that we were physically attracted to each other. I should do that better next time, right? So that also really resonated with me in the same way that the characters being in their 40s and being divorced or having just gotten out of a serious relationship really resonated with me. But I realized as I started reading that it isn't something that you see in romances that often. And once I started reading it, I was like, oh my God, I love this. Thank you for doing this. Everything from that more circumspect and mature lens on what has the makings of a relationship to having that baggage that comes with having had past serious relationships to even just her body having stretch marks from having a kid or whatever. I just found it so great to have characters that were, like you said, are in their midlife. It shouldn't be such a rare thing, but it really is. And so I wonder if you could say more about that.
Yeah, I was just like, well, sure. Of course she'll be this age. There was probably a benefit, like I said, to not having read a ton of contemporary romance to see, oh, I'm not sure that this is really on trend. I think when I read historical romances, I pretend I don't know how old they are because the female characters are always so young. I'm like, you're not 20. But
you're my age. It's fine.
Yeah, of course you are. You're not in these situations when you're only 20. But I do think it was partially for myself. When I started the book, I was 39. And I was definitely looking at that decade in front of me, looking at this number that we have been told is really significant in aging. And I was remembering being 8 or 9 when my dad turned 40 and how we threw him this surprise party. It was all black themed, so grand, these over the hill balloons and streamers. And I'm thinking, like, the guy was only 40, right? But I was looking at that myself. And I was also thinking as my kids were getting older, looking ahead. It's a line I have in the book because that's a line I use a lot in my life, that my kids are growing up and away from me. And that's what they're supposed to do, but that there's still a reckoning with that. And so I definitely created Celeste in, I think, a lot of ways to be a role model for me. I was trying to write this future into existence of having a good amount of confidence, having some selfishness, being in the stage of watching your kid. Her kid is 17, getting ready to graduate high school, getting ready to leave the nest. I created that for myself as this kind of like teaching tool. And because of just how much time everything takes, I started this book and then put it aside and wrote a whole other book and then came back to Burning with Benefits. And so a lot has happened since I started it. Now, when the book is coming out, I am now older than Celeste is in the book. She's 42. I'm now 43. My oldest kid is just a couple months away from being 17. So I'm like, okay, hopefully I can take my own advice. I wrote this for myself and now I'm here. And so that's been really interesting to think about. But I think in large part, that was just a character that I wanted to see and that I wanted to know.
I love that. And being someone who's in their 30s, I'm 34, I thoroughly enjoyed the characters. I love the book. And to me, it does feel like if this is what I have to look forward to in my 40s, I'm ready. Not to make time move like quicker than it has to. But yeah, I absolutely loved it.
I think that our 30s and 40s are just a really fun time to set romances because I think most people, hopefully in that age range, are going to be able to tell you, you have this confidence. You have this sense of, I think I might know who I am. And I think part of knowing who I am means I don't know who I am, right? But like we understand
You're at least aware.
And we understand, and we understand that the people around us also don't know what we're doing, as opposed to when you're younger and you're always looking at the people at the next stage and you're thinking, that must be when you know what you're doing because I don't know what I'm doing, but they must. And I think it's around 40 when you're like, nobody knows. And that's like pretty freeing, right? So I think that's a really exciting phase to capture in a romance because I think it really can be this next phase of opening up your wings.
Yeah, absolutely. What about John? I am thoroughly in love with John. I love him. My husband isn't here right now, so I can say that out loud without it being weird.
He's not going to pop in. Who are you talking about?
He just is such a great character. And like you were saying, is so different from Celeste. And so obviously there's a little bit of opposites attract. But the way that you were able to get into his head, because I'm a writer too, but I hardly ever write men POVs because I just feel like I don't understand men enough to be able to do.
Right.
But I think that you did it so well. And he is such a guy in some ways where I'm like, that's such a dude thing to do. But he also is so sensitive. He's so sweet. He pays attention to Celeste so closely. And I really loved him.
Thank you so much. Yeah, he was a really fun challenge because when we talk about the opposites attract aspect of the novel, Celeste is very vivacious. She's very loud. And John, he's a very quiet person and he's not grumpy. I've seen it called the grumpy sunshine sometimes. I don't think he's grumpy. I think he's just reserved. And something that I really like exploring with that is the fact that we as people are allowed different comfort levels of how much we share. Celeste is someone that is going to process every single thought she has out loud. If she thinks it, she's going to say it out loud. John is a person who is going to process a lot in his own head, and he is allowed to do that. I think that sometimes we think that in friendship or in relationships, we're required to like flay ourselves open and show every thought. And for me, just as a person growing as an adult in a relationship, that's been a lot of personal work that I've done is thinking, you know what, I get thoughts to myself. I get feelings to myself. I get to decide what I share. And obviously in a relationship, it's a give and take, and you're going to work out your balance of what do you need to know from me? What do I want you to know about me? But my partner doesn't deserve to hear every thought in my head. That's up to me. And so that was something that I really liked exploring with John, was just that he was a person that processes a lot more internally, and that Celeste allows space for that, while he also does need to learn to speak up for himself a lot. But even in that case, it's for his own benefit, right? It's not for her benefit. It's to ask for what he wants and he needs. So that was really fun to give John that space and think about. And as a writer, it was a fun challenge too, right? Because John isn't the kind of person that can just sit down for coffee with his bestie and hash it all out, because that's not how he processes things. So that was just an extra fun writing challenge.
Mm-hmm. I really love that his best friend, Chris, and him have an understanding that if Chris hasn't heard from him for 3 days, he checks in.
Yeah, I was just thinking that about that same part. That was such a good illustration of his character and Chris's, and also a great rule of thumb for anyone who's like John.
Right? Yeah, because sometimes people do just want to be alone. And I won't give spoilers, but there's a point at which Celeste has an argument with her daughter, and she's upset, and she's with John, and they're just really quietly sitting together. And she thinks to herself, if her best friend Maria was there, we'd have 3 glasses of wine and a box of Kleenex, and we would have gone over this whole thing 1,000 times, and that would be fine. Mm-hmm. That also is a good way to do it, but this is a different way to do it. And that's also worth exploring, right?
I love that. So we've mentioned Chris and Maria and Morgan a little bit, and I wanted to talk about the side characters. Morgan, M, Chris, and Maria specifically. They were so well developed. I feel like we got to know them really quickly in a short amount of time. How do you do that so well?
Yeah, thank you. I think that I have to credit back when I was working on a previous manuscript, someone beta read it for me, an early reader, and she commented on one of my side characters in that book. And she said, it feels like he is only here to serve this one specific person, right? He's only here to serve this character's growth. And in doing that, he is falling into some stereotypes. And it was one of those tough love set of things where I was like, whoa, you're really correct. And it really helped me think about, how do I make side characters whole people and give them their little mini arcs that they're going through. And that serves the book too, because in the side characters having their stuff going on, their best friends, who are our main characters, get to help them, right? So we can see what Celeste is like as a friend. We can see what John is like as a friend. And I think those are really important things for us to see and understand about our characters, especially because when they have main character energy, you're seeing a certain type of them, right? Like with Celeste, she's in this period of discovery after her divorce. She's saying yes to everything. She's kind of got this crazy frenetic energy about her. And I think it's really important for us to have the moments where we can see her with her friend and we see her focusing on Maria. We see that she's not thinking about herself all the time, even though she is sometimes, and she's allowed to think about herself a lot of the time, but that she can focus on another person, that she can really be a generous and caring friend and a really generous and caring mother to her daughter. I think that trying to make sure that our side characters have their whole own lives also lets us see other sides of our main characters.
That's so smart.
Yeah, I love that. You mentioned that you put it away for a little while and then came back to it. What was that about? Did you do it because you felt like you were stuck with it, or?
It's funny to think back on. So I started the Birding Book, and at that time, that's what I called it for years, the Birding Book. And I kind of created, I call them linked series. I don't know if that's the official phrase, but they have characters and you don't have to read them in order, but they might have characters in common. So maybe it's like a set of brothers and each brother gets his own book. So that was how I started to envision, as I built a family for John and a history for John when I first started drafting the Birding Book, I gave him these brothers and I started to imagine. And I don't know why I picked the order I did, but I made John at that time the middle brother when he had an older brother. And I wrote about 40,000 words of stuff for the Birding Book. and then was like, well, okay, nice try. You're learning how to write, but that wasn't really good. Let's like figure out what to do next. I had decided that John's brother Jake was the oldest, and I was like, if I want this to be a series, it makes sense for me to write the oldest brother first. So I paused on the birding story and I wrote a book for Jake. And that is the book that then I had when I met my critique partners. That's the book that I got agented with. I got a literary agent, and I went out on submission, which is when your agent sends your book out to the publishing houses in hopes that they'll buy it. I went out on submission with that book first. Okay. And while that book was out on submission, I started over with the birding book. And that was really interesting too, because when I started it, I was writing it as a second book in that series. And so John's brother Jake appeared a lot in it. And then as I was getting rejections on that book, it's not hooky enough was really the big thing. It didn't have enough of a hook. So I was starting to think more and more like, okay, birding's got to be a hook, guys, right? I'm just thinking like this birding book's got to be a better shot. And so I kept revising it. And every time I revised it, I took more of those first book characters out of it. It hurts my heart because I love Jake and I love all the scenes I wrote for him in Birdie with Benefits, because it's like, it's so fun to see after you've already met a character to see them again, right? So in the book I had written, he falls in love, and then in the next book, he's got little toddlers climbing on him. It's just the best, but whatever. It's okay. R.I.P. to
right.
So while that was getting all its passes, I was reworking the Birding book and making it its own standalone, which included making then John the older brother. That was part of his personality, and then was out on submission with that book for a year.
Wow.
And got about 17 rejections on that one before it was acquired.
I can't believe that, because it is so good. It's so hooky. Talk about having a great hook.
Yes. Super hooky, right? I mean, you can just say in one sentence, it's a birdwatching romance. I really try to emphasize to folks as they're looking for agents and they're going on a submission. It's hard to understand until you're looking at it that these books that are coming out by these bigger publishers, there's a handful of editors looking at all of them. I just truly think sometimes it probably comes down to the weather, right? What kind of mood is somebody in? They are getting so much material and they're so strapped for time that something has to really absolutely call to them. And when it doesn't, it's really hard to explain why. So when you're on submission and you're getting rejections, you really want to make sense of the thing. What do they mean? What can I work on? What can I work on? Like, all it means is it just didn't click in the super duper duper way that it had to click for that editor. And it doesn't mean anything else. It doesn't mean anything about your writing. It doesn't mean that all these books that are getting published are better than yours. It doesn't mean anything except that your chances of getting traditionally published come down to 10 people, right? 10 editors, and what their days look like when your manuscript pops into their inbox. So it's a journey, that's for sure.
I mean, I haven't gotten to that point, but I have also, writer friends and critique partners who have. And yeah, it's just so subjective, because it's also, what kind of day are they having? But what do those 10 people like? That's not representative of what everyone likes, right? It's just what those 10 people like. So it is very, very subjective.
I'm probably lucky in that my editor, she'd worked on the editorial side for a long time and then worked in marketing for many years and had just gone back to acquiring. And I was the first book she acquired when she was back. Our email caught her when she had capacity. She was ready. She was looking for projects to bring on. At this point now, she's been acquiring books for another year and a half. So now she's all full up. So sometimes it's just timing like that too.
I think it ties in so well with the rereading discussion we were talking about. I think it was Elizabeth Gilbert in Big Magic. She had submitted a short story to someone and got a rejection. And I think years later, I hope I'm not making this up, but I have this memory that years later, she submitted the same story to the same person and it got picked up that time. And they didn't have any recollection of her first submission. Yeah.
Right.
And that really made her career take off.
And that's such an important reason that we need to be talking about and pushing to for so much more diversity in publishing and who's working in publishing, because it just makes it even harder for writers of color and folks from marginalized communities, because someone's going to read their work. And you hear this all the time. Editors are like, I didn't relate to this. Well, sure, you're not going to, but you sure as hell should have someone on your staff who does, right? I think that's always something to be thinking about and pushing for.
Yeah. Your cast of characters is very diverse. Is that what you were just saying, that it's just that's the way that the world is, and so we're trying to represent that? Or were there specific stereotypes that you were trying to address and break down, in addition to the 40-year-old people are also human and can fall in love stereotypes that we talked about?
Yeah. It's definitely something that as a white writer, I think about a lot, because my perspective is that I don't have the lived experiences or the perspectives to write from the point of view of non-white characters for my main characters. But that doesn't mean I don't want to show the world as it really is. When I think about writing in the world I'm creating, I think a lot about writing less from the world that I grew up in and even that I live in now with my peers, and more writing for my kids, not for them to read it, but for it to represent their world, right? Because their world is really different from mine. And it's really different from the one I grew up in, fairly different from the one I'm in now, right? So in their lives, their friend groups are incredibly varied in every way, right? In terms of gender identity and race and all types of experiences that they have. And so my goal is to really show that world and also show those attitudes. I think as we have more queer characters, more non-binary characters and genderqueer characters, it's not a matter of representation. It's just a matter of what does the world look like? The world is full of all different kinds of people. And so all those kinds of people, I want them to all appear and have a home in my books.
Yeah.
You know?
It's very well said.
Yeah.
So you have talked about a couple of tropes that you love and that you used in this book. But are there any tropes that you really love that you wanted to make sure to use that you haven't mentioned? Or are there tropes that you hate that you really wanted to avoid? Because there's so many tropes in romance, you know.
So many tropes, right? We haven't really talked about it with Birdie with Benefits, but it is a fake dating book, which I'll be honest, as I was writing and getting the feedback from the other book and hearing that it wasn't hooky enough, I was like, well, okay, let's pull some hooks out of this bucket. Everybody loves fake dating. But I grew to love the fake dating aspect of the book, because I think fake dating comes with a lot of built-in moments and expectations to play with. Something that I think is so fun about writing romance is that often you can feel like you're in an inside joke with your readers, right? Like, here we go, guys. Okay, they're going to a party. They're just going to pretend to flirt with each other. So I think it's really fun. A trope that kind of lasts the length of the book is really fun to play with all of those moments that are included in it. In general, tropes that I tend to really fall for, I love a sibling's best friend trope. Just love those. I love roommates or housemates. Oh my gosh. If you have to move in with your brother's best friend for some reason, that is just like, that's
chef's kiss.
That's ultimate. And you might be able to tell this from reading my book. I really like consent, not just in intimacy, but in emotional connections and in communication and in friendships. Consent and communication is really important to me. And so this is not in any way to say that those don't exist in these tropes, but I do tend to shy away from any kind of power dynamic tropes. You know, someone is a boss or someone is in a position of power. Same with age gap, because I feel like often it plays on some of that. And that's just not my thing, but it's certainly a thing for a lot of other people. But in general, I'm very soft. So I can't handle love triangles. I can't do a whole lot of angst.
That's cute.
I was just thinking when you were talking about how much you love fake dating, that it's such a great way to illustrate consent. And then you brought that up because they get put in so many situations where the characters have to see what the other person's boundary is. Is it okay if I hold your hand? Is it okay if we do this and that? And that just kind of snowballs. And I love the way that you handled that in the book too.
Thanks. Yeah, I really like making characters explicitly ask each other things like that. And I think about consent in my book sometimes as aspirational. I understand that is not always how we treat physical interactions and sex in real life, but I would really like it to be. And so my characters are always going to do that. Mm-hmm. They're always going to check in with each other, and I was going to talk about stuff in a novella that I wrote under another name. Someone was like, if you have a consent kink, this is for you. I was like, well, okay. I didn't know that was like a kink people claim.
Yeah.
But okay.
I don't feel like it should be categorized as a kink. But what I was going to say, which is in line with that, is that it is really sexy. Mm-hmm. The way that I think that people act about consent sometimes, not as much anymore, but definitely when I was in my 20s, is that it ruins the mood, it ruins the moment, it's not sexy. But the way that you write it and the way that I've seen it written in other books too, it actually is more sexy.
It's so great. And what do you like? I mean, we should want to know how to please each other.
After I finished the book, the first thing I texted to Liz was like, oh my God, she wrote the sex scene so well. I think sometimes, even in books that you love, the sex scenes can come across a little cringy, and there's zero cringe in this book. I thought you just did such a good job. How do you approach writing those sex scenes?
Yeah, I mean, I'll preface this by saying I think there's really great romances out there that are closed door sex where it's not quite as graphic as in my book. But I really love sex scenes because I think that they show so much intimacy and so much trust and so much fun. And it is this important way that these two characters are getting to know each other and getting to interact. It's funny that you say that because when I was annotating that book, like I mentioned, I got to the end of one of the sex scenes that for Celeste, it's a really emotional moment of giving in to pleasure and also asking for things that she wants. And I made a little note and I said, this scene is why I write open door romance, because I want to be able to show that huge experience you can have that is physical, but it's emotional and it's trust and it's all those things. And so I look for all of that. I'm really trying to do all of that in my sex scenes with the book I'm working on now. And the same with Writing with Benefits. My editor is like, I like these scenes, but they're really, really long. You have 40 pages of sex. And I'm like, here's the thing. I don't really have 40 pages of sex because they're talking a lot in the middle of all of these acts. The actual sex is a couple of pages, but it takes a lot of time to get us there. And it's fun to think about how I'm evolving as a writer. I think when I started writing romance, I would start with the sex scenes in my head, or they would be like, the carrot would be like, just get to the sex, get to the sex. I don't quite feel that way about it anymore. I think I'm finding ways to think about how am I describing things? How am I describing body parts? How might I want to do that differently? Do I want to scale some of this back in description and let some of the emotion or sensation rule the scene? So it's fun to think about in that way, but I really like it. Part of bringing a romance into the world is being really vulnerable and exposed. And, you know, my coworkers know I wrote this book, especially when you write a romance, people want to be like, are your parents going to read this? And I'm just like, well, maybe that's up to them. And their reactions to it and their responses to it are their responsibility, right? They're not my responsibility. But thank you. I'm glad you guys like them.
It's very wise too.
Yeah.
So what messages or themes do you hope that readers take away from this book? Is there anything specifically that you identified while you were writing it?
You talked about what was the book that you said inspired you, that there were 3 words that kept coming up. Do you have those
Georgia
3 words for your book?
Yeah, for Writing with Benefits, discovery is definitely it's the theme. And I'm not shy about throwing that word into every chapter because I think it just speaks to so many different aspects of the book. There's that discovery of what is possible in the next phase of your life. There is the actual discovery of all these birds that are all around. And John is an experienced birder and Celeste is brand new to birding. And as they're paired up, it's not just her that's learning something, right? Because he's kind of relearning what he loves about birding through watching her discover all of it. And so just really this sense of discovery. I've been incredibly pleasantly surprised by how many people have read the book and told me that they're interested in birds and birding. And I did not expect that at all. I didn't write this book as birding propaganda, but if it functions that way, all the better. But I really hope folks take away with that. That can look like looking out your window and watching something in a tree. That can look like just standing outside and observing something. You don't have to run out and buy the gear and become an expert. It's just about looking for those little moments of discovery.
I did text Martha at one point, I think, while I was reading it, that it was making me want to become a birder.
Yes, it's so exciting. I love it.
That's really cute.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned at one point that you were working on another rom-com. Can you share any details about what you have coming up next, or no?
Yeah, I can share a few details. We talked about these linked books where one character appears in the next one. I put together a few pitches of different ideas and I sent them to my editor. And one of those pitches was, in truth, a pitch I wrote as a joke because I thought it would be funny. And it was about Chris, the best friend in Birdie with Benefits. I literally threw it in as a lark. And in large part, because for folks who haven't read the book, he's our lovable side character. He's a wildlife biologist and a professor, and he studies snails. Snails are his specialty and his passion. The next book is not exactly for people who might love Birdie with Benefits. It's a different book. It's going to bring new readers. It's going to find new people.
I personally can't wait for your next book.
Mm-hmm.
I think I probably will love it if I have to make a prediction. Is there anything that you want to say about the book that we didn't cover or anything like that?
I would speak to the audio a little bit, especially since Martha's an audio listener. I can't say enough about how excited I am about the audio for Birdie with Benefits. I got to listen to it early, and it sounds melodramatic, and I am melodramatic, but I really think it changed my life. When you're writing a book, you write it so, especially like the way I write, I wrote this book so many times, and then you revise it, and then you go through copy edits, and then more copy edits, and then more copy edits, and then past pages, and then proofreading. And the book is just like a series of phrases. It's a series of chapters. It's a series of potential mistakes. I spent months and months with the book in that stage. And then I got to listen to the audio, and I experienced the book. I experienced it as a story. And truly maybe for the first time, because I have been piecing this book together for so many years, that to hear it as this whole thing performed by these incredible narrators was just, I just can't even explain how it made me feel. It was just so wonderful. And so I think that the narrators absolutely hit it out of the park. I'm not a person who talks about the universe, like the universe wanted this to happen or whatever, but the universe wanted this to happen because I'll just tell you guys the story. They sent me 5 samples for each, like 5 male samples and 5 female samples, because the book is dual POV. And so I had these samples in my inbox. They're not people reading my book, just their general samples of other things they've read. And I know because of who I am that I would either decide in 5 minutes or I would decide in a torturous month. And I was like, I'm just gonna make this decision right now. I'm just gonna listen. I'm gonna go on vibes, pure vibes and instinct, and get this done. And so I listened to all 5 male samples first. I listened to like 30 seconds of them. And there was one that I liked right away. I was like, okay, I think this might be it. I listened to them again. And I was like, okay, yeah, I think this is it. I think this is him. And I played it for one of my kids, and she goes, he sounds really nice. And because you guys have read Birdie with Benefits, you know, I was like, yeah, okay, that's it. Because there's a lot of alpha male energy in romance, and that's not John's style. And so I was like, okay, this is it. This is the one. And then I look at the name and I'm like, okay, Evan Sibley. And any birders who hear the name Sibley might perk up their ears, because there's Sibley bird guides, North American bird guide, Western bird guide. I grew up with Sibley guides in my house. It's just a big name in birding. And I was like, oh, that's weird. Like Sibley, what a funny coincidence. No, he actually is a Sibley. His parents are both ornithologists.
Oh my God.
His dad has written countless bird guides. And I was like, Are you kidding me? He's got like literally like birds in his DNA. I found out after the fact he's a huge birder himself. Like
Perfect.
he, okay, wait. So then I listened to all the I listen to all the women. I follow all the same things. I'm like, it's her. I listen one more time. It's her. Mia Hutchinson Shaw is her name. I send their names in. Okay, I come to find later that they are really in love with each other in real life.
Oh my God.
What?
Oh.
Yeah, I'm serious. It's just so, and like I've gotten to know them now, and they're just the best, and they did the most amazing job, and they just have this really deep personal connection to each other and to the material of the book, and it's just been this joy. I did not expect like these things pop up in publishing that you just aren't ready for, and it has just been so joyous to get to know them and to hear the work that they did on the book and what it's meant to them. And so if there's any audiobook fans, they just did an absolutely incredible, beautiful job. Mia captures Celeste's energy so perfectly, but also her maturity and her thoughtfulness. And then Evan just has this perfect way before John speaks. You feel this micro pause of like preparation, right? That just feels so perfect to the character. They just did an incredible
I can't
job.
believe that.
Yeah.
2 audiobook narrators that are together. I just love that.
Yeah.
I feel like that needs
And I
to
just
be
like
a
picked them
romance.
both on vibes.
Mhm.
My friend Livy Hart, she has a rom-com called Talk Flirty to me that is 2 audiobook narrators. It's a second chance they used to date, and now they're doing an audiobook together. But so if that sounds fun, listen to that one.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for talking with us today. Just as a reminder, Birding with Benefits by Sarah T. Dubb comes out June 4th in the U.S.
It comes out in the UK at the same time, and we were told that birding is not a phrase in the UK, so it's called bird watching with benefits in the UK, but it comes out at the same time.
And did you say in Canada as well?
Yeah, Canada too.
We've really loved this conversation. It's been great.
Yeah, it's been really fun. Thank you guys both so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for giving us so much of your time.
Yeah. If you'd like more bookish content, make sure to follow us on Instagram and TikTok at All Books Allowed Pod. If you have any feedback or suggestions for future topics, you can send us an email to allbooksallowedpod@gmail.com. Make sure you leave us a positive rating and review because it helps other people find us. And read on, my friends.